Well, I grew up in rural western Colorado, a small cattle mining and coal mining town, and it was an unusual situation. It was a very poor area. My father was a traveling salesman, and in ordinary circumstances, that would have made us lower middle. But because everyone else had less money, it actually made us like the wealthiest folks in town. And so it was really a funny situation. But I spent a lot of time hunting fossils and being off in the sagebrush and the washes looking for fossils and bird eggs and stuff like that. I was a strange child.
That's what they always said about me. They used to call me the little old lady because I would talk to the rocks and the bushes and things.
Yes, well, I've been 7 going on 90 for as long as I can remember.
And then you're like me.
Yes.
Psychedelics don't make that much of a difference to you then, do they?
Well, I don't know. When I think about what led me to psychedelics, I think it was quest for beauty in nature. First it was, I don't know, butterflies, and then it was shells, and then it was reef fishes, and it was really a quest for beauty. And the notion of hallucinations was just magnetic to me. I can remember reading Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, and this notion of hallucinations, I just wanted to have one. I couldn't imagine such a thing. I mean, I was quite a sort of a rationalist, and the idea of seeing things which aren't there, why, who wouldn't pursue that? It sounds absolutely daft. So, I did, and look where it's taken me.
Well, by the time I was 9 or 10, I was a earnest practitioner of ceremonial magic, and I would draw pentacles in my room and bird and rosemary, and I was also an altar boy at this time, and it made some problems. I recall one time, I don't know how many of you are recovering Catholics, but there's a thing which they bring out once a year. I don't know if they still do this. They've sort of left the faith, but they have this thing which they use at midnight mass and Easter called an aspergillium, and it looks like a baby's rattle, and you put it in water, and it has holes in the round head, and it fills with holy water, and then you can fling holy water great distances with this thing. And so one day back in the sacristy, we were cleaning out some things, and the priest came upon this old aspergillium. And I said, whoa, he was about to get rid of it. And I said, whoa, I have a use for that. And he said, oh, what is your use for this, my son? And I said, well, I'm involved in the conjuration of Azael, the 11th general of the Mercuric sphere, and it launched an investigation that has made that town unsafe for the practice of ceremonial magic to this day. But the point of my story is they needn't have worried because, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but look, I'm paid to be controversial, you understand? So they needn't have worried because, at least for this lumpen Irishman, it didn't work. No matter how much rosemary I burned, no matter how many wax sigils were formed, no matter how many even more peculiar things were undertaken, it didn't seem to cut the mustard. And then, around the time that I was 14 or so, I had many obsessions. I mean, my life seems ruled by obsession. And at some point I became aware that there was a book at the library that they didn't want me to read. This was when I was somewhat younger. And they didn't want me to read this book. And the librarian, who was friends with my mother, had been told if he asks for this book, don't let him have it. So I not only determined to read the book, I determined to read every book the author had ever written. And the book was Brave New World, which I don't know how many of you have read it. It wouldn't stir a small wind these days, but it did involve, all the women did wear these prophylactic, some kind of, I never quite understood what it was, but it's some kind of birth control kit that they wore on the belt. And of course, people were grown in vats and had very free sex and so forth and so on. It was an interesting book, but then I started reading the author, Aldous Huxley. And I read Chrome Yellow, and I read Antic Hay, and I read After Many a Summer Dies the Swan, and I read Ape and Essence, and some of these things were like screenplays, and some were comedies of British manners. I kept hoping we'd get back to the prophylactic belt thing. And instead, eventually, I came upon The Doors of Perception, and read this book, and it was like, it had never entered my mind. The concept of drugs, intoxication, information from reflection of that sort. I mean, the whole thing was just completely puzzling to me. And I can remember following my mother around the kitchen of our suburban home, saying, if 1/10 of what this guy is saying is true, this is the most amazing thing in the world. Well, now we know that that's a very mild book, very limited in its claims. I mean, he talks about staring at the folds of his trousers and thinking about Hildegard von Bingen, and it's basically presented as a thought thing. And most of you look like you're probably not old enough to remember, but there was a point in the evolution of awareness about the psychedelic experience where the way people did it is they piled up art books, favorite recordings, foods, perfumes, and then they would get loaded, and then they would look at the art books, eat the orange, smell the perfume. It's not a bad idea. But that was the clue to me, that there was something going on. And as I say, I was about 14, and I had a lot ahead of me before I really took my first trip. And I was trying to figure it out, shopping in the supermarket of ideas of the time, reading Camus, reading Nietzsche, reading Sartre. And all these people are a huge downer, as any of you know who've read them. I mean, the entire tone of modernity is just one big downer after another. You know, if it's not Hannah Arendt on the triviality of evil, well, then it's Karl Jaspers on something else, or Sartre, and it's just horrible, horrible stuff. Well, so I became aware through Huxley that there was this other possibility, and Huxley always wrote about the psychedelic experience as a branch of the mystical quest, what he called the perennial philosophy. And so I started reading both the scholars of mysticism, such as Evelyn Underhill and William James, varieties of the religious experience, and so forth and so on. And I started reading the primary sources. Teresa of Avila, Thomas Traherne, Jakob Burma, what's the singing nut, Hildegard von Bingen, all of these people. And I got the idea that there was this experience, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it in, on my knees at the church for hour after hour. I mean, I found various forms of existential boredom ad infinitum, but and I would sit in nature, and I would hyperventilate, and I would do all these things. Well, the juice just wasn't coming. Well, to make a long story short, eventually, like lots and lots of people, and by my own personal route, I found my way to these things. And they are, to my mind, astonishing, worthy of taking risks for, because they work.
I think to some degree it's true that all culture is somewhat unfriendly to the individual. When their heavy arm falls on your shoulder and they tell you that you're going to be sent off to some foreign hellhole to kill people as a young man, you definitely suddenly get the notion that culture is not your friend. But perhaps, if you're a 12-year-old boy in an Amazonian tribe and they announce that now it's time for the 2-week abandonment in the woods, from which if you live to tell the tale, you'll become a full member of society, I'm not sure those kids greet that with a leap of joy in their hearts. It's like, oh my God, now this. We knew it was coming. I went through rites of passage like that were excruciating. Where I grew up in Western Colorado, you weren't a real man unless sometime between 12 and 16 you killed an elk. Hunting season every October was an excuse for this insane rite of passage, and my father was an unquestioning inhabitant of his culture, and so this was always in front of me. And when I was, when I was 12, I went the first time. I didn't get anything. The second year we went out, and my father, I'm sure, had no idea what a wilted pansy I was in this situation, because I had hid it from him. I was concerned about all kinds of things, and eventually this situation arose where they put me up on this point and gave me a gun and said if anything came by to blow it away. And by God, this thing chose to sacrifice itself as far as I could tell. I mean, it did not behave at all like elk behave. It basically just came out of the woods, stood still. I pulled down on it, closed my eyes, prayed. There was an enormous noise. When I opened my eyes, there was nothing whatsoever to be seen. I felt an enormous relief that this thing had escaped, and walked over to find it dead as a doornail. And, the oak leaves dipped in the blood, the cup of blood, the whole thing. I mean, I couldn't believe how atavistic this stuff was. However, I never had to please my father again. I was home free. Everything was forgiven from that moment on. But it brought home to me how uncomfortable culture is and always has been, I think. I've always been sort of a knowledge freak. I mean, I was a very weird kid. I knew I was weird when it was happening, but now that I have a 15-year-old son and watch how he does it, I realize how absolutely weird I was and how alarming I must have been to my parents. And I was not socially adaptable at all because I had bad eyes and poor coordination, and I was very easily intimidated. And the story of my early schooling was in a town of only 1,200 people, I was able to find 1,700 different ways to get from school to my house in order to avoid being pounced upon by roving cannibal bands of my peers who had sworn to get me, and they never got me. It was astonishing. And
Is that New York?
No, this was some cowtown in western Colorado. And the other thing I discovered early on, and maybe this is too psychotherapeutic to waste time on, was that I could hold them at bay with story. And essentially I became like the king's jester, you know. And then I could hang out with these lumbering, lumpen people because I was always willing to verbally outrage and say crazy things. I mean, like one of my things that really got me a lot of points with the tough guys was I could stand up in class and very rapidly speak sentences into which I could occasionally drop obscenities, but you just couldn't quite hear it. But the kids could hear it, but the teacher couldn't, and it was this. So that was my scene. But in terms of the relationship to knowledge, I love. It's what William Blake said. You know, he said. Attend the minute particulars, and that's what's interesting, I think, is the details of the distinctions among things. I mean, that's why I was a butterfly collector, an art historian, a Tibetan art hound, a rainforest botany person, because what it's all about is the incredible variety of morphological expression in the world. Now, I suppose a Buddhist would recognize this as a serious samsaric hang-up, you know, that I love the texture of the apparent visible world.